So the United States is in a depression, and really the entire globe is in a depression in different ways. But there has been a rise in dictatorships throughout other parts of the world. Some of that has been brought on by the lack of stability in the economy. Some of that has been brought on by frustrations from colonialism and the Great War. And in the United States, while there is a depression, there have been some efforts on the part of FDR to stave off this depression and get the economy moving again. And some of those programs have been successful, some have not been so successful. And we are now nearing the end of the 1930s. And as we are inching towards the end of the 1930s, even though there have been some successes from those programs, there hasn't been the type of success that would really rebound the economy. Now, at the end of World War one of the things that Woodrow Wilson really wanted to get into place was that League of Nations in his 14 points plan. And if you recall, he made this great pitch, and Europe signed on, and they said, yes, we support this League of Nations, which would sort of keep these larger nations in check, but it would also help them to protect one another. Now, he returns to the United States, and Henry Cabot Lodge says, no, absolutely not. And Lodge has a lot of support in Congress, and so Lodge really actively works to keep this from passing. Woodrow Wilson goes on a coast-to-coast tour to try to drum up support from the American people for the League of Nations. And while on this cross-country tour, he suffers a very serious stroke, and he is pretty much incapacitated for the remainder of his presidency. He is not able to function, he's not able to make decisions, and his wife, Edith, really spends pretty much the final 18 months of his presidency guarding him and keeping the public from him so that people don't know how unhealthy he is, but also to protect his reputation and his legacy. And so the League of Nations, because it isn't passed, is something that really changes the way the rest of the world views the United States. And so the end of World War One really signals the beginning of isolationism in U.S. politics. The United States continued to engage in international affairs. It signed what was called the Kellogg-Briand Pact, which outlawed war in national policy. It expanded its foreign investments throughout the world, and it also opened up diplomatic relations with the Soviet Union in 1933. Now, prior to World War I, the United States had really been interested in parts of the world that might prove beneficial in terms of business, but the United States wasn't overly involved in being engaged in international affairs and diplomatic relations, or even investing in these countries as a nation, only making it possible for businesses to do so. The United States embraced a form of isolationism that rejected participation in any type of international organizations, particularly the League of Nations. the World Court, and anti-war sentiment really proliferated popular culture and literature, especially in the 1920s after the First World War. In 1934, the Senate began investigating bankers and munitions makers and labeled them merchants of death. They pushed for the United States becoming involved in the First War, according to the Senate, because they would benefit from being able to sell munitions, weapons, things of that nature. The hearings were actually headed by a man named Senator Gerald Nye, and he appealed to the spreading isolationism and the anti-business mood that was prevalent during the Great Depression. As the Great Depression continued, most Americans believed that the United States government should only be concerned about the United States. Between 1935 and 1937, Congress passed a series of neutrality acts, and they were an effort on the part of Congress to create barriers to U.S. involvement in European wars. Remember, the primary objective with keeping the League of Nations from being signed was staying out of foreign affairs. The Neutrality Acts prohibited private loans or the sale of munitions to any belligerent nation, and required that the belligerent nations pay cash for any non-military purchases and ship them on their own vessels. So Congress really takes great pains to keep the United States out of what is appearing to be a Second World War. They make it completely illegal to sell any type of weapon, military aircraft, those types of things. But then they go further and they say that if the United States businesses choose to sell other products that are not military products, like clothing, food, to these other countries, that there has to be an actual cash payment. It cannot be purchased on credit, and those nations will have to come and collect those products because the government doesn't want to risk sending an American merchant ship into international waters. In 1933, Adolf Hitler rose to power in Germany and installed National Socialism, or Nazism, at home while striving to create the empire of the Third Reich abroad, as part of his mission to rebuild German global power. After World War I, and economic despair had completely devastated and demoralized the country. Now, Hitler views the end of World War I as something that completely devastated the German economy. And his goal is to restore Germany to its pre-World War I power, and then to extend that power and expand that power. In 1936, Hitler sent troops to the Rhineland between Germany and France. And in 1938, he pushed Austria to unite with Germany. And with the support of Great Britain and France, Hitler annexed the Sudetenland in western Czechoslovakia. Germany was unopposed when it moved to occupy the rest of Czechoslovakia just a few months later in the spring of 1939. In 1935, Italy was led by a dictator named Benito Mussolini, and Mussolini invaded the independent African nation of Ethiopia, overthrowing their emperor. In 1936, Italy and Germany offered support to General Francisco Franco in his effort to overthrow Spain's democratically elected socialist government. As the Spanish Civil War erupted, the United States maintained neutrality, though some left-leaning Americans volunteered to fight with the Spanish Loyalists as part of the Abraham Lincoln Brigade, and others offered financial support to the Loyalist government. But in 1939, Franco's forces were victorious. Now, it is important to understand that part of this concern on the part of these Americans was the historical involvement that the Spanish people had had with parts of Latin America, and this concern, this interest on the part of Americans about a dictator overthrowing a democratically elected government. Now, most Americans were very wary of any U.S. involvement in a European conflict, but Roosevelt understood that the United States needed to remain engaged in world affairs in spite of these neutrality acts. War formally broke out in Europe when Germany invaded Poland in September of 1939. Britain and France promptly declared war on Germany and Italy, but the Soviet Union had just signed a non-aggression pact with Germany, a move on the part of Joseph Stalin to delay any direct conflict with Hitler. Now, Hitler will break this pact in June of 1941, but Stalin doesn't want to engage the Nazis in a direct front. Roosevelt publicly maintained U.S. neutrality, but acknowledged that most Americans would embrace the Allied side if necessary. By 1940, Germany had ratcheted up its aggression, launching blitzkrieg, or lightning war, across Europe. After conquering Denmark, Norway, the Netherlands, Belgium, and Luxembourg. As German victories mounted, opponents to American involvement in the war formed the America First Committee. This organization utilized the concern felt by many Americans about becoming dragged into yet another European war. The commitment of the isolationists was tested when France fell to German control in June of 1940. The British then endured a bombing campaign on London and other targets by the German Luftwaffe, or Air Force. The Battle of Britain put forth the effort to maintain neutrality in the United States very much on shaky ground. Now, in the wake of France's defeat, the vast majority of Americans supported some degree of aid to the Allies, while opposing the United States immediately entering into the war. Roosevelt responded by arguing that offering assistance to Britain was a way of actually preventing the United States from becoming involved in the war. Between September of 1940 and November of 1941, the United States offered significant aid to Britain, including a provision of destroyers in exchange for leases on British naval bases throughout the Western Hemisphere. This transaction bolstered British morale. On September 16, 1940, the U.S. government enacted its first peacetime draft through what was called the Selective Service Act. This act registered more than 16 million men. At the same time, Roosevelt promised his constituents in his 1940 campaign against Wendell Willkie, quote, "Your boys are not going to be sent into any foreign war," end quote. In March of 1941, Congress passed what was called the Lend-Lease Act, which authorized the lending or leasing of military and other equipment to Britain to protect the British ships carrying those supplies. The United States increased its defensive measures, patrolling the North Atlantic by air and by water. By the middle of 1941, the United States and Germany were engaged in an unofficial but a full-fledged naval war. In August of 1941, Franklin Delano Roosevelt and Winston Churchill signed the Atlantic Charter, which advocated free trade, self-determination, freedom of the seas, and, quote, freedom from fear and want, end quote. Roosevelt also promised to protect certain parts of the North Atlantic until the right crisis came along that would allow the United States to intervene more fully. After several German U-boat attacks on U.S. ships later that year, Congress repealed the earlier neutrality acts. The United States had turned its attention to events across the Atlantic, but across the Pacific, U.S. relations with Japan had been gradually deteriorating. In 1931, Japan had invaded Manchuria, and after the Japanese forces moved further into China in 1937, the United States began supplying China with arms. In 1940, Germany and Japan signed a pact. Italy also signed the pact and invaded Indochina. This led to a larger increase in concern of conflict with the United States. Tensions erupted on December 7, 1941, when Japan launched a surprise attack on the U.S. Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, killing more than 2,400 Americans, destroying battleships, cruisers, and destroyers, and almost 200 planes. The very next day, on December 8, 1941, Congress voted to declare war on Japan. On December 11th, Germany and Italy declared war on the United States. This brought a rapid end to U.S. isolationism and brought the United States into a full-scale war. The United States joined the Grand Alliance with Britain, the Soviet Union, and the French government, which was in exile. But various factions within the alliance disagreed on how to dismantle Germany's military. The Soviet Union promoted the opening of a second front in Western Europe to defuse German aggression. Great Britain wanted to focus on pushing the Germans back in North Africa and Southern Europe to protect their colonial power. Roosevelt understood the Soviets' demands, but voted to postpone an invasion of France. In 1942, the Allies' strategies began to work. They pushed the Germans out of Egypt, and after a series of battles in Algeria and Morocco, out of Africa altogether by 1943. The Soviet Union had held the German forces back at Stalingrad, but they still needed a second front in France in order to protect their own interests. Roosevelt pushed the invasion back to 1944, and this exacerbated tensions between the Soviets and the other allies. British, American, and Canadian troops invaded Italy in July of 1943. Mussolini was quickly removed from power. It wasn't until June of 1944, however, that the Allies finally occupied Rome and pushed the Germans out of central Italy. In order to appease Stalin without opening an immediate second front, Roosevelt extended the Lend-Lease program to the Soviet Union. And in November of 1943, Roosevelt, Stalin, and Churchill met in Tehran, Iran, and mapped out war strategies. The Soviet forces would enter the fight against Japan after the European War ended. The second front would be opened within 6 months, and an international organization to promote peace would be established at the end of the war. Now, to give you a visual, I want you to make some kind of mental notes here. These orange areas are the Axis powers. So this is Germany, Italy, those areas right there. This yellow area is Great Britain, Axis controlled areas. These are the areas that Germany has moved into. The Allied areas are here in green. Great Britain, the United States over here, the Soviet Union. And if you're looking at this map, you can understand why Stalin over here in the Soviet Union is very concerned, because Germany, which is here, has already moved in and taken these parts of this territory, which includes the Ukraine, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Latvia, Estonia, East Prussia, all of these areas here. And at the same time, they have managed to push out and control other areas in what is Africa. So this is very concerning. Great Britain here is very much an island, and their concern is that if the Germans get into Great Britain, which isn't that far from France where they've already occupied, that they will move into this territory here very quickly. So you can understand the concern of the Americans who do not want to engage in a war with Germany on two fronts, right? They don't want to fight them over here and over here. They want to fight one front at a time. Now, on June 6, 1944, General Dwight Eisenhower led 1.5 million American, British, and Canadian troops across the English Channel for an invasion of France at Normandy. And here is the English Channel, and here is where they will move into this territory. By August of that year, the Allies had liberated Paris, and by late 1944, they had regained total control of France and parts of Belgium. In the wake of the Allied military success, Roosevelt easily won re-election to a fourth presidential term. Harriet Truman of Missouri became the new vice president. Now, at the same time that there is a war in Europe, there is also a war in the Pacific. And I will go ahead and let you view the map. In 1942, U.S. forces under the command of Generals Douglas MacArthur and Curtis LeMay and Admiral Chester Nimitz, began a campaign to liberate the Japanese-occupied islands in the Pacific. So that will include Beijing, Korea, Thailand, Singapore, Manchuria, which is very close to the Soviet Union. The Allies saw victories in the battles of the Coral Sea and Midway Island, at Guadalcanal Island, in the Mariana Islands, and eventually the Philippines. By 1945, they were poised for a major battle with Japan. The U.S. Marines won significant victories at Iwo Jima and Okinawa, but suffered significant losses as the Japanese demonstrated their intention to fiercely defend their homeland at all cost to their own death. The U.S. Army Air Corps firebombed Tokyo, killing about 330,000 Japanese civilians, with the hope of completely decimating the Japanese economy and making it impossible for Japan to sustain a war. But the Japanese stood firm in the face of both the firebombing and a blockade which prevented supplies, food, and medicine from entering into the country. The Japanese retaliated by sending kamikaze pilots to crash their planes into American ships and other American planes. The Japanese were committed to ending the war only if they were victorious. And without victory, the Japanese were willing to sacrifice all of their soldiers. Now, by 1945, the Allies had made significant headway in both the European and the Pacific theaters, and they needed to create a plan for a post-war world. But a number of significant questions remained. In February of 1945, the Allies crafted the Yalta Agreement. The Yalta Agreement laid the groundwork for free elections in Eastern Europe, but the Soviet Union, which had been invaded through Poland at the outset of both wars, was very frustrated by this agreement. The Allies remained committed to the establishment of a United Nations, and they reached a tentative agreement to divide the post-war Germany into 4 zones. One zone would be controlled by the United States, another by the British, another by the French, and another by the Soviets. In mid-December of 1944, the Germans made one last effort to save their cause. They launched what was called the Battle of the Bulge. The Allies pushed the Germans into retreat across the Rhine River, and this resulted in a series of events that led to the fall of Berlin and German surrender on May 7th. Even as the Allies were closing in on victory in Europe, the United States remained focused on achieving a great victory that was swift in Japan, and had the potential to do so with the development of the atomic bomb. Now, in 1942, a group of U.S. scientists and engineers, led by Robert Oppenheimer, began developing an atomic bomb. Congress spent $2 billion on what was called the Manhattan Project, but they had no idea what the project actually entailed. The people who worked on the atomic bomb really knew very little about what they were doing, but they knew that they were doing important work that would help to bring about an end to the war. Harry Truman learned of the bomb after he assumed the presidency following Roosevelt's death in April of 1945. He warned the Japanese that they faced annihilation if they did not surrender. And the Japanese agreed to comply. They agreed to surrender with one condition, and that was that they were able to keep their emperor, Hirohito. Now, the United States refused to accept anything less than unconditional surrender. For the Japanese, keeping Hirohito would have been an encouragement to continue the war in the future. And for the United States, they really wanted there to be a culminating event that signaled victory for the Americans. On August 6, 1945, a B-29 bomber named the Enola Gay dropped an atomic bomb on the Japanese city of Hiroshima, killing instantly 80,000 civilians and imposing death by radiation poisoning on tens of thousands more. 3 days later, on August 9th, the United States dropped a second bomb on Nagasaki, killing 100,000. On August 14th, the Japanese agreed to surrender, complete surrender. Most Americans supported the decision to use the atomic bomb. Truman argued that Roosevelt probably would have done so, and that the decision would save American lives. He also believed, as did most Americans, that this attack was really a retribution for Pearl Harbor and for the Japanese wartime atrocities. In the process of overthrowing Nazi rule in Germany and Poland, Allied forces saw firsthand the extent of Nazi concentration camps, designed to exterminate or work to death more than 11 million Jews, Slavs, Poles, Gypsies, homosexuals, disabled people, and communists. The camps were filled with mass graves, crematoria, and survivors who had barely staved off death from starvation. Despite the fact that reports of the camps had trickled out of Germany since the beginning of the war, Americans were shocked at the revelation of the Holocaust. Earlier in the war, Roosevelt had turned a blind eye to the atrocities, fearing the military risk and danger to the inmates if an attempt to liberate the camps was made too soon. Failing to loosen immigration laws to accommodate a greater influx of Jews and other persecuted minorities from Europe, the United States offered asylum to only 21,000 refugees. This reflects the widespread anti-Semitism in the United States State Department.